Yo estudio español, no es bueno. But I am working on it because we have a Chilean son-in-law, and so I'm very excited about our coming grandchildren, and that's why part of the reason why I love Spanish so much. So I'm working on it, but I should begin by giving you a little sense of what it's like for me when I'm going to my day job. So this is me. I'm going to my day job, and I live in Michigan in the United States, and we have a lot of snow there, so you're really, really lucky here. And so as was mentioned, I teach this course, Learning How to Learn, with Terence Sanowski. And Terry, well, Terry is the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute, a preeminent neuroscientist. And this is Terry going to work at his day job. So that's one of the great things about online learning today is it really, it helps people, not only the students to get together from different backgrounds, but also the professors themselves can come from very, very different backgrounds. So I have to say, I was shocked one day when I was invited to speak at Harvard University. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's Harvard. And here I am, just a little Midwestern professor. And so I was very nervous. And I walked into the room, and the room was packed, standing room only. And I thought, why are there so many people here? It turns out that our one little course made for less than $5,000, mostly in my basement, had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's online courses and MOOCs put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. So what this tells you is something very important. Well, first, it tells you anybody can do it. But then it also tells you how much people really are craving to learn more about learning. I mean, it's something that, isn't it amazing? We go through 12 to 16 years of education, and we never get a course on how our brain works so that we can learn more effectively. So for me, I should probably back up a little bit and tell you a little more about my own background and how I came into learning. As it turns out, I grew up moving all over the United States. So by the time I was about 15 years old, I'd lived in 10 different places. Now, if most of the time, it doesn't matter if you move, you get pretty much the same education, except for one thing, and that relates to learning mathematics. When you learn math, it's extremely sequential. And if you fall off anywhere along the way, it's really hard to get back on. So when I was moving from Lubbock, Texas to Chelmsford, Massachusetts, I was about 7 years old. And suddenly, they were way far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. So you might think, oh, she's super smart, she figured it all out. No, I didn't like math to begin with. And so when they were far ahead of me, I just thought, I don't like it. I don't have the math gene, so I'm just not going to do it. So I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which really is kind of embarrassing to admit here because I really am a professor of engineering, and I'm the real deal. I mean, I publish in top journals. I'm a fellow of top engineering organizations. So one day, one of my students found out about my sordid, terrible past as a math flunky, and he asked me, how did you do it? And I thought about it. I mean, how did I do this? I was this little girl, and I really love this picture because it is the last cute picture of me. But I loved animals, and I loved weaving, and I loved knitting, and I loved all those kinds of things. And I knew I could never grow up and do anything technical because I didn't have the genes. And so I thought, what can I do? And I just thought, well, what I'd like to do is learn another language. I should have picked Spanish. But kind of randomly, I picked Russian. And so I want to learn Russian. How could I do it? Well, I couldn't afford to go to college and learn a language, but I found out there was one way I could learn a language and actually get paid for it, and that was to join the Army. So there you see me looking really nervous, about to throw a grenade, and if you knew how clumsy I actually am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I did learn another language, and I ended up working on Soviet trawlers, as was mentioned, up in the Bering Sea, and I just loved having new adventures and seeing the world through new perspectives. So I also ended up in Antarctica at the South Pole Station, and that's where I met my husband. So I always say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man, and there is my hero standing right in the corner. Yay! So it's only been 35 years. I'm a very lucky woman. So I thought, here I was. By the time I was, I was 26 years old. I was looking to get out of the Army, and, my commitment was ending. And to my surprise, I'd done everything that people had told me to do. I'd followed my passion. My passion was to learn a language. And when I was getting out of the military, guess what? Nobody wanted my degree in Slavic language and literature. I mean, it was just like, who wants Russian? And that's your only skill set that you can do. And so I began to really think about things more. I had worked when I was in the Army with all these West Point engineers, and I remember looking at their books, and it looked like a foreign language. I mean, they had all these equations in them, and I thought, now wait a minute, aren't I supposed to be open to new adventures and having, kind of seeing the world through new perspectives? What could be more bizarre for me than to learn an analytical skill like engineering? So, at 26 years old, I decided to go back to the university and learn math and science and become an engineer. And it was not easy. I had to start at remedial high school algebra. I remember looking at my books, and if you look at my books now, they have these dimples in the pages. Why do they have dimples in the pages? It's because I would look and I'd read, and it'd be like, these people have purposefully written this textbook to make it impossible to understand. And I'd get really, really angry, and then I'd take a fork and I'd stamp the page with the book. But how many of us have these same sorts of issues? I mean, we'll try to learn something. It's really difficult, and we get very, very frustrated. And sometimes we give up. We think we can't do it. But what I did was, I slowly worked my way up through the years and got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, then a master's in electrical and computer, and then finally a PhD in systems engineering. And as I was working on all of these, then I began teaching. And then, as I was teaching, and that student asked the question, how did you change your brain? I thought, I like to write books. And so why don't I write a book about changing your brain as you're learning something new? So I went back. I had a lot of background in neuroscience from other books I'd worked on and in cognitive psychology. So I worked on a manuscript. I wrote it all up. And then I tracked down the names of thousands of the top professors who were known as very, very good teachers. And I asked them if they would take a look at the manuscript for this book. Shocking percentages of them said, yeah, I'd love to look at your book. And what surprised me was, of all these people, they would come back and they'd give me some good insights, but I would often get this one comment from them. They'd say, I do this one little thing when I'm teaching, and I use it to help students learn, and it's really super powerful, but I don't want you to tell anybody else that it's me that's doing it because the other professors will give me a very bad time. And that one little thing was the use of metaphor. It was like this shared secret handshake that they had with, that these great professors would use is a metaphor to convey ideas. Why did they not want to share that with other professors? Because other professors would say, who weren't as good a teacher, they'd say, you're just dumbing down the material using these cheap and easy metaphors. You got to make it tough for them to really get it so that they're learning the real stuff. But we now know through neural reuse theory that if you're using metaphor to convey key ideas, that you're actually using this set of links you've already created for one thing, and allowing students to use that same set of links to build a new set of links much more easily. So, for example, learning how water flows is actually a very difficult thing to do. I mean, that's why babies play a lot with water, and they're really. But if you know how water flows, you can much more easily grasp the idea of how electrical current flows. And yes, do positive particles flow this way when actually negative particles are flowing the other way? Absolutely. At a quantum level, everything breaks down. But when a metaphor breaks down, you just throw it away and you get a new one. And metaphors are a very powerful way of learning. Now, I reached out as well as just top professors. I also reached out to top neuroscientists, top cognitive psychologists. I myself have taught for decades in science, technology, engineering, and math. And so what I'm going to present to you here today is some of the best of what I found about how we learn effectively. So the brain, as we know, is enormously complicated, but we can kind of abbreviate its main characteristics into two very different modes of operation. The first I'll call focus mode, and that's hopefully what you're doing right here today, focusing, and that's activating a somewhat limited set of circuits in your brain. Of course, all of your brain is working, but a specific task-positive network, as a psychologist would say, is being activated, or set of task-positive networks. Now, the other mode that your brain can operate in that's very different is that of what I'll call the diffuse mode. So diffuse mode is you're still having thoughts, and they may even relate to what you have been working on or thinking about, but they're much more random. They're the kind of thoughts that you have when you're standing in the shower, or you're going for a walk, maybe riding in a car. So what we're going to do is we're going to illustrate these ideas using I hear it, metaphor, yes. And the metaphor we're going to use to really help you understand these ideas better is that of a pinball machine. Now, a pinball machine, if you're of a certain age, You'll remember how that works. And if you're not, then the way the pinball works is you pull back on the plunger and the ball goes bouncing out, and that's how you get points. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take that pinball machine and we're going to put it right down on the human brain. So, are you ready for it? Okay. Oh, I see all these enthusiastic faces. It's fantastic. Okay, here we go. There's the pinball machine on the brain. So this is our analogy for the focused mode of thinking. And if you look, see those rubber bumpers? They're really quite close to one another. And what happens in this mode is you often have patterns that you've created already by virtue of the fact that you already know the material. So let's say, see, there's a pattern, and let's say you already know, my biggest failing when I was growing up, but you're pretty comfortable with multiplication. And let's say that I asked you to multiply 72 times 47. A few of you could do it in your head. Others would pull out a piece of paper, but in any case, your thoughts would... Ooh, maybe we want to, Jose, maybe you want to turn that down just a little bit. So your thoughts would move along those patterns you've already laid. So this is all well and good, except what happens when you are learning something completely new. So you know multiplication, but let's say you're learning division. So you're sitting there, you're working a problem. Well, when you're first learning something, you can inadvertently default. So let's say the new pattern you want to lay is something like that darker pattern there. And that, say, is division. So you're trying to learn division, but you inadvertently start falling back on these patterns you've already laid because the new pattern isn't there yet. You haven't put it there. You don't know how to put it there. You're trying to figure it out, so you inadvertently go back to your old pattern, and then you can't solve the problem because you're using the wrong patterns. So you get more and more frustrated, and you eventually take a fork out and you stab the page with the book. And then you close and you walk away. Well, what's interesting is when you walk away and you get your mind off of it, so you've been focusing, now you get your mind off it, and you get into the diffuse mode. So when your mind actually does get off it, which may take minutes or hours, more likely hours, it opens up this other way of thinking. And notice how broadly spaced those rubber bumpers are. So you can't think in a careful, focused way as you can when you're learning or when you're in that focused mode. But you can think in a much broader way. So as your thoughts go, they can range much more broadly. And you can at least get to the new perspective you need to be in order to solve that problem or understand that new concept. So as it turns out, when you're learning something new, your mind is often going back and forth between the focused and the diffuse mode. So you focus, you get it in, then you have to kind of think a little more freely, about anything else. And then during that time, your mind is consolidating. You cannot be in both modes at the same time unless you are taking certain forms of mushrooms, and I am not advocating that. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to try. So if you would, I would like you to take 2 minutes, and I would like you to turn to someone who's beside you, either someone you know or maybe someone you don't know, and introduce yourself. And then I'd like you to explain what is the difference between focused and diffuse mode You have 2 minutes. On your mark, get set, go. All righty. So let's come back together here. One thing, did you notice something that when you stopped and you turned to one another, you actually momentarily went into the diffuse mode? So what that meant was, didn't you feel like you got a little bit of a fresh perspective on what we were just talking about? It's very helpful. So if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're a teacher, it can be really helpful to explain, but then also give a chance for people to kind of take a step back and learn and sort of consolidate the ideas they've been learning about. Now, just to give you a little bit of a different sense of what we've been talking about, if you look, so you can think of it as like 2 tables in your brain. You've got the focus table on the top, diffuse on the bottom, and what happens is you kind of have to force your thoughts back into focused mode. So you have to force yourself, even if you like it, you often have to force yourself to some extent to pay attention to what's going on. And inadvertently, your thoughts will inevitably go someplace else. So a little bit of diffuse mode there. But for some people, it's almost like they have extra holes in their pinball table. So they force themselves to focus, and then that ball is up there, but it will inadvertently fall away, and they find themselves going into diffuse mode, whether they like it or not. So those people with ADHD or attentional disorders, as we'll talk about a little later, they can actually have advantages. So it's just a different way of thinking that can be advantageous. So in teaching the course Learning How to Learn, one thing that I've found very interesting is that we have feedback from people all over the world, and one of people's biggest issues is procrastination. And that is, of course, simply putting off something you don't particularly want to do. So procrastination is such a big issue worldwide that it's worth devoting just a few minutes to it. So, procrastination, as it turns out, all you do when you're, when you think about something you don't like and don't want to do, it activates a portion of the brain that experiences pain. So the brain, naturally enough, looks for ways to stop that negative stimulation. And so here's what it does. Procrastination is just a habit. like any habit, it can be good or bad. And what happens with this, though, is you think about something you don't like or don't want to do. You don't feel so good, so you turn your attention to something else. And the result is you feel happier almost instantly. You do this once, you do it twice, no big deal. You do it very often, and it can have really big long-term consequences on what you think you can do and be successful at. You can even think, oh, I don't have any ability to learn this or that, and it has nothing to do with your actual capabilities. It's just that you're putting everything off until the last minute, and few people can learn under those kinds of trying circumstances. So since I'm an engineer now, we're very practical, so I will just cut immediately to the chase and say, what do we do to address procrastination? The best way to handle it is with the Pomodoro technique. And this was invented by an Italian, Francesco Cedillo, in the 1980s. And you'll notice he had this really cute little timer, and that's because timing is very important for this technique. Here's all you have to do is first turn off all distractions. So no little ringy-dingies on the cell phone, no checking, little pop-ups on the computer. And then once you've got your distractions all turned off, unfortunately, you cannot turn off a small crying baby, but you do the best you can to get an uninterrupted period of time. Then you set a timer for 25 minutes. Any timer will do. And then you focus as intently as you can for 25 minutes. Now, if you're like me, this is what I do. I will, I'm messing around. I don't really want to be working on something or other. And so I catch myself. So I set a Pomodoro timer, and I sit and I start to work on the Pomodoro, and I work really, really hard, and my sweat's pouring from my brow, and I know I have worked a long time. And then I look up at the Pomodoro timer just to see how long I've worked, and I've just worked 2 minutes of the Pomodoro. And my mind screams, I cannot do another 23 more minutes. But I just do the Zen thing. I let that thought go right on by, and then I return my thoughts to whatever I was working on. And that's the trick, except for one more thing that is the most important part of the Pomodoro, and that is to reward yourself. So by reward, I mean, you might have a little cup of tea, you might listen to your favorite song, you might dance to your favorite song. Oh boy, Jose, we have a problem. Can you accept it? I hope. Well, I'll keep talking. Jose, hopefully you can grab it. Oh, I see. See, we speakers, we have a cheat screen. So this is my screen, which is the same as your screen, except right now. This screen is being really different than your screen. So I would have thought you were seeing what I'm seeing, but now you're not. So I'll just go with what you're seeing here. So anyway, remember how we always have thought of learning before. Learning, we think of it as it's focused, but it's not. Learning is when you're focused and when you're not focused, when you're taking a break. And so what that means is you focus and then you take a break, that diffuse break, so it can, sort of make more sense for you. And between that, with that reward period, you're getting the diffuse break, and that can really help kind of drive home your learning. Now, let's say I'm working away and I'm really, first I hated it. I don't know if you guys do this, but I'll hate something and I'll get started working on it. This is maybe not that bad, And then, and then the 25 minutes will sound, and I'm like, yeah, well, I want to finish this one. And then I'm kind of really getting into it. And if that happens and I'm into the flow, I'm perfectly fine. Yeah, I can go an hour, maybe 2 hours. But when I'm done, I make sure to reward myself. And what that reward is doing is it's actually helping to rewire my brain to some extent. So that Pomodoro technique is really a terrific one. I have to ask, who here has already heard of the Pomodoro technique? Okay, a fair portion. Who has heard of the Pomodoro technique because they've watched Learning How to Learn? Oh, so now we know. Okay. So I think it's important for us to step back even further for a minute and look at the basic building blocks of the brain. How does the brain really learn? And to do that, of course, we need to look at the neuron, which is the fundamental building block of the brain. There is about 100 billion of them in your brain. So I just so wish you could see your faces now. You can see so many of you are just kind of like, oh gosh, this is when she gets to the super boring part where she goes into the science. So let's spice things up a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll use a space alien. And our space alien is what's the word? Metaphor for our neuron. So here we go. We've got, here's the body of the neuron right there and the nucleus within it. That's the eye. And our space alien, can you see how it's kind of reaching out with its arm? And that arm in a real neuron is called the axon. And the axon in real life, it reaches out and it's going to touch the toe of the next neuron. And what is the toe? Here's the toes of our space alien. They're called dendritic spines in the real one. And dendrites they're like the legs of the neuron. So here we've got 3 dendrites. And then space aliens have lots of toes. And similarly, neurons have dendritic spines. So axons reach out to the toe, the dendritic spine of the next neuron. And that's the big thing they do, is they talk through their hand-to-toe communication. So let's see that in action. Here we go. We've got our 2 space aliens. And our space aliens are reaching out, and they're touching. The one arm is touching the toe of the next. Now, what is happening with neurons, they're sending signals to one another. So those signals will travel along, and they'll go from one neuron, jump across that little gap, which is called the synaptic cleft, and then they'll travel to the next neuron. Now, of course, we know it's actually more complicated than that. So here we go. We've got that signal traveling along. It goes along the neuron. And then at that space where there's that little synaptic cleft, it actually, chemicals are going across there, and then it jumps across as an electrical signal. So it's electrical, chemical, electrical. But since I'm an electrical engineer, we'll just pretend it's all electrical. So when you learn something, what you're really doing is you're simply creating sets of links between neurons. So in this particular case, we can think of it as, let's say it's actually more complicated, but you can think of it symbolically as, let's say you're learning, I'm learning to conjugate a verb in Spanish. So that set of conjugations in present tense is perhaps represented by 5, it's probably more than 5 neurons that become connected together when I can conjugate a verb in Spanish, or when I can play a chord on the guitar, or when I can make a dance movement, take a derivative in math. So each thing creates a set of links in certain neurons. So as you practice, you are able to strengthen those sets of links. So the more you practice, the bigger and stronger those sets of links become. Now, you can think of them almost like sets of links in a chain. So the more you practice, the bigger and the stronger the links in that chain become. And what happens though? What happens if you have sat there, you watched your professor in class, you took notes, and then you walked away and were super busy for 2 weeks and didn't look at the material? You understood it when the professor said it. You were creating those sets of links. But if you don't use those sets of links, what happens is your little synaptic janitor can come right by and sweep those links away. So this is why it can be really important to practice with the material. What is happening is when you're learning something, you learn it, and that's causing those links to come out. And then as you're sleeping at night, that's when the links really practice and connect together. So sleep, that is why sleep is such an important part of learning. Young people in particular will often say, oh, I can get by on just a few hours of sleep. What they're doing is they're actually making it so the brain is not creating very good connections because it doesn't get the sleep time where the connections are being created. So in fact, I can show you a light microscopy image of before learning and before sleep, and that's right here. So you see all these little dendritic spines coming out. Now, look at what it looks like after learning and after sleep. If you look right here, this little blue triangle is indicating a new dendritic spine that arose, that erupted out during sleep. So right now when you're watching, you are getting little buds coming out in your dendrites. So little dendritic spines are starting to emerge. When you go to sleep at night, especially if you kind of think back on some of these ideas, they will really bust out. They will really start making those new connections of learning. So this idea is why it can be so important to practice every day when you're learning something. 10 hours, let's say you take 10 hours and you cram it all in one day. Very weak set of links. In fact, they're so weak that your little synaptic janitor can easily sweep them away. But so let's say 10 hours in one day is far less effective because you only have one night of sleep where you can create those links. And if you have 10 hours spaced out 1 hour each day, then each night you've got a chance to build and strengthen those connections, and you will learn much, much more effectively. So by metaphor, it's a bit like building a brick wall. If you lay that foundation really, so you lay the first layer of bricks, lay the mortar, the second layer, and then let it dry for a while before you go too tall. So each day you're giving it time to dry. You'll have a very sound foundation for learning. If you don't, the wall will look something like that. It's really not a good foundation for learning. So if you want to, you can kind of think of it a little bit like this. I think this weightlifter, we can look at him and we know he is not waiting until the night before the big meet and then just lifting a bunch of weights to get himself all ready for the meet. But we'll do this kind of thing with learning all the time. People will often, I'll cram the night before. Well, just as we need to grow muscular structure, you need to grow neural structure. And that neural structure is what's happening when you're learning. So this, in fact, brings me to one of my favorite athletes of all time. And this is an individual named Julius Yago. So Julius was he is a Kenyan who, well, if you know anything about Kenya, you know that they have a lot of long-distance runners, and they're really, really good. Well, Julius, look at those arms. He was not interested in long-distance running. He was interested in throwing the javelin. The problem was there were no javelin throwing coaches in all of Kenya. So what did Julius do? He went to YouTube and he started watching videos on how you throw the javelin. And then he'd go out actively practicing each day. So he's growing those dendritic spines as he's actively practicing. And do you know he became the world champion javelin thrower? And that was 99.9% just from YouTube watching and practicing on his own. So if you're interested in online learning, it is really, you can learn things you think you could never learn. But Julius had another advantage, and that was he was learning something that involved physical exercise. And as we now know, physical exercise is really valuable. It provides a valuable enhancement for learning and memory. And we've long wondered, why does exercise seem to help people learn and remember better? Well, very recently, like in the last year and a half, researchers have discovered why this happens. And it turns out that when you exercise, you produce in your brain a chemical called, abbreviated as BDNF. It's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And what scientists did was they took this factor and just for kicks, they more or less sprinkled it on a bunch of neurons. Here's a neuron before they sprinkled this BDNF on it. Now, here is the exact same neuron after application of BDNF. Look at that, all of these dendritic spines just sprouting out. It's just amazing. And can you see? That would be really helpful. If you've already got a bunch of extra dendritic spines hanging out there, they're just waiting for you to learn something so you can start hooking things in. It really can enhance your learning. So using these kinds of exercise is really a powerful way to help with your learning. Now, we should talk just a little bit about the importance of the different areas of memory. And the first is working memory. That's like short-term memory, and that is what you can hold in mind temporarily. So if I asked you, I said, 72, 49, 36, remember that. You'd kind of go, 72, 49, 36. You'd repeat it to yourself. And that repeating is you holding it in working memory. And that is being held in a place in your prefrontal cortex, so it's right here. And this is as opposed to long-term memory. And long-term memory is more scattered around in different parts of your brain. And long-term memory, of course, is things like remembering what your friend's face looks like, or the name of, or the address that you live at, or you used to live at. So it's information you have stored in your long-term memory. And I should add, whenever you learn something, it means you have stored information in long-term memory. If you're holding it in your working memory, you haven't really learned it. So what this means is sometimes you'll look at a book and you'll go, oh, I got it. Well, you do. You have it right there in working memory, and it will stay there as long as you're looking at the page, but it won't be there when you look away from the page. So this will lead soon to a little trick that I'll give you to help you retain information more in long-term memory. But anyway, let's figure out a way that we can metaphorically imagine working memory. And the good way to do it is to just think of it as a attentional octopus that's got like 4 arms. What are those 4 arms? Those are like well, if you know any psychology, it's the 4 slots of working memory. We used to think that working memory could store 7 items in it. And now we think it's probably more like 3 or 4. I was so relieved to hear that because my working memory is more like 3 or 4. If I haven't had my coffee yet, it's more like 2 if I'm lucky. So working memory, again, is in the prefrontal cortex. Your long-term memory is scattered all around. I'm going to represent it as a locker. And that locker, inside the locker, is a set of links. In fact, it's got an enormous body of sets of links about all the things that you've learned. So when you're learning something the first time, I guess I should say, this brings me to our daughter, Rachel. So when you're learning something the first time, your working memory is often going a little bit crazy. It's trying to put together a nice set of links. But once you've learned it, you've got those set of links. Your working memory, that octopus, can just reach out and grab the link. And then you can do whatever you wanted to do. So for example, our younger daughter, Rachel, I asked our daughters, when we were creating the massive open online course, I said, who can model the idea of backing up a car really badly? And my younger daughter, Rachel, was like, Mom, I can do this. And indeed, if you look here, she's backing up a car, and this is pretty much what she was originally like when she was learning to back up a car. She was terrible. She didn't know which way to look. Everything was really hard for her. And what was really happening was, as she was trying to back up that car, her working memory was really working hard to try and create those sets of links for the information she was learning about backing up the car. So she had a heavy cognitive load. Her working memory was really, really busy. And all of the arms of her attentional octopus were very, they were taken up by learning, let's see, do I look here? Do I look there? Which way do I look? But once she learned how to back up the car, well, she can just back up the car. And as she's backing up the car, what can happen is, she's got this sort of light cognitive load. She just reaches in, grabs that set of links about how to back up the car, and it's easy. She can just back it up, and she doesn't have to really think so much about it. So once you've created that set of links about backing up a car, or this is how you do an algebra problem, or this is how you conjugate a verb, or play a musical instrument. Once you create those sets of links, your working memory can just haul them right up, and you can easily do whatever you're working on. Experts, as you gain mastery, what is often happening, you've created sets of links about the topic you're learning, and then you take a test, and what happens is your working memory just kind of goes down, grabs something out of working memory or out of long-term memory. Oh, this set of links. And I got to hook it into this one, and suddenly you've just solved that problem. So learning involves creating a nice set of links that your working memory can easily put together. And in fact, experts of all types, their kind of their common factor is that they have an enormous set of neural links about that particular topic that they've learned. So, gaining expertise in is really a question of creating great sets of neural links. Now, this brings me to just illusions of competence in learning. Have you ever, here's what I'll do. I'll take a page of a book, I'll read it, I'll get all the way to the end, and then I don't know what I've just read. I mean, do you do that too, or am I all alone in the world? So I'll read a book, get to the end of the page. I don't know what I've really. The best way to read and retain what you're learning is to read a page, then stop, look away, and see if you can remember what the key idea on that page was. By looking away, you are ensuring that it's not just something that's in your working memory. You're looking away and you're trying to kind of put together the key idea, and that has been shown to be an extremely valuable technique. This is called recall. So read a page, look away, see if you can recall the best idea, or the key idea. This is much more effective than, like rereading or using concept mapping or underlining and so forth. Recall is really effective. Now, the other way to help overcome illusions of competence in learning is to test yourself. So test yourself at every possible time you can. So create flashcards, cover up part of a book and see if you can remember key things. Whatever you can do to always be testing yourself. And of course, the worst thing is if you have, let's say you have a problem in a science or math class and you want to solve that problem, the worst thing to do is look at the solution, think you know how to do it, and then move on, because you have not worked actively to create that set of links. And that's when you can end up on tests thinking, oh, I have test anxiety, when actually it's just your brain is churning your working memory because it has not yet created those sets of learning of links. Now, when we're learning, we often make the mistake of thinking that some of our very best traits are really bad traits. And what do I mean by that? So for example, let's take a poor memory. We often think a poor memory is a really bad thing. But I am here to tell you that a poor memory is actually a really good thing. And how could that be? Well, think about it this way. So some people, remember we've got those 4 arms of working memory on your attentional octopus. So you've got them, and some people, they don't have just 4 arms. They have like 8 or 9 arms. They can hold all this information, and they're really sticky arms. So they can hold this information and work with it and do all this stuff. Other people, more like me, are like, they got the 4 arms maybe of their attentional octopus. They got the information in, they got it, woo, shiny. They get distracted and something falls out. But when something falls out, something else comes back in. And these individuals are often found to be more creative or very creative. So if you're one of those people that has a poor working memory, actually, sometimes if you had the choice, which would you rather have? Poor working memory and be creative, or strong working memory and maybe lose a little of that creativity? Most people would opt to keep their poor working memory. So it's not to say that people, for example, my colleague in teaching the massive open online course, Learning How to Learn, Terry Sanowski, has a working memory kind of like, 85 tentacles on his octopus arms. I mean, he's amazing. He's also very creative. So there are exceptions to every rule. Now, the other thing, though, is sometimes people will learn very slowly. So they think of themselves as being slow thinkers. And indeed, sometimes in my classes, I'll ask a complicated question about Bayes' theorem or whatever we're working on. And there'll be someone in the front row, before I even have the words out of my mouth, their hand is up in the air. They're ready. They've got the answer. And you can see the other people in the class sort of thinking, well, what's in it for me? I mean, I'm never going to be a fast thinker like that. But if you think about it this way. Some people do have race car brains. They can get to the finish line really fast. Other people have more like hiker brains. They can get to the finish line, but it's much, much slower. But think about what that hiker experiences. They can reach out and touch the leaves in the trees. They can smell the pine in the air, hear the birds, see the little rabbit trails. It's a completely different experience than the race car driver, where everything goes by in a blur. So if you are a slower thinker, you can sometimes see things and understand more deeply than even a really, really fast thinker. In fact, my hero in science is a fellow named Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And of course, this is, there's the Cajal Institute here, and he was a terrible student and a rotten learner. And he was kicked out of school when he was going through school. And, it's amazing to consider he is now, he won the Nobel Prize and is now thought of as the father of modern neuroscience. And Cajal was once asked, how'd you succeed? And he said, I was no genius. And he wasn't. It was hard for him to learn. Things did not stick in his mind. He didn't have a good working memory. He said, I was persistent and I was flexible when the data told me I was wrong. So he said, I have worked with many geniuses. And what geniuses can do is they're smart. So they're used to solving problems and being right, which means they don't get much experience being wrong. And because they're fast thinkers, they often jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they are not used to making corrections. So he felt his own flexibility, as opposed to that of geniuses, was part of what allowed him to become such a great researcher. So if you are not a genius, rejoice, because you can sometimes do things even geniuses cannot. So with that, I would just like to thank you and Rafael del Pino, and I simply cannot thank you enough for your attention, and I love the fact that you're so interested, as I am, in learning. Thank you.